to read something to you from this book. It's chapter 1, actually, and the title is Negativity Kills. I think it's so relevant to what's happening in the world right now. And without knowing about this, we're not really educated about the conditions around us and the harm that it's potentially doing. So listen to this. Negativity kills. When we started writing this book, the first question I asked my grandfather was, why did you begin studying what is right with people? So let me back up. This book is by Tom Rath and his grandfather, Donald Clifton. And this is the adult version, I call it, to the children's story of the same title. So if you don't know the children's story, go look that up. All right. Why did you begin studying what is right with people? Don answered my question without a moment's hesitation. His review of one specific case study had altered the entire focus of his career and life. And this story was about as far as possible from a positive or inspiring story. And then it goes to tell the story. Following the Korean War, Major Dr. William E. Mayer, who would later become the U.S. Army's chief psychiatrist, studied 1,000 American prisoners of war who had been detained in a North Korean camp. He was particularly interested in examining one of the most extreme and pervasively effective cases of psychological warfare on record, one that had devastating impact on its subjects. American soldiers had been detained in camps that were not considered especially cruel or unusual by conventional standards. The captive soldiers had adequate food, water, and shelter. They weren't subjected to common physical torture tactics of the time, such as having bamboo shoots driven under their fingernails. In fact, fewer cases of physical abuse were reported in the North Korean POW camps than in prison camps from any other major military conflict throughout history. Why then did so many American soldiers die in these camps? They weren't hemmed in with barbed wire. Armed guards did not surround the camps. Yet no soldier ever tried to escape. Furthermore, these men regularly broke rank and turned against each other, sometimes forming close relationships with their North Korean captors. When the survivors were released to a Red Cross group in Japan, they were given the chance to phone loved ones to let them know they were alive. Very few bothered to make the call. Upon returning home, the soldiers maintained no friendships or relationships with each other. Mayer described each man as being in a mental solitary confinement cell without any steel or concrete. Mayer had discovered a new disease in the POW camps, a disease of extreme hopelessness. It was not uncommon for a soldier to wander into his hut and look despairingly about, deciding there was no use to try to participate in his own survival. He would go into a corner alone, sit down, and pull a blanket over his head, and he would be dead within a few days. The soldiers actually called it give-up-itis. The doctors labeled it marasmus, meaning, in Mayer's words, a lack of resistance, a passivity. If the soldiers had been hit, spat upon, or slapped, they would have become angry. Their anger would have given them the motivation to survive. But in the absence of motivation, they simply died, even though there was no medical justification for their death. Despite relatively minimal physical torture, marasmus raised the overall death rate in the North Korean POW camps to an incredible 38%, the highest POW death rate in the US military history. Even more astounding was that half of these soldiers died simply because they had given up. They had completely surrendered, both mentally and physically. How could this have happened? The answers were found in the extreme mental tactics that the North Korean captors used. They employed what Mayer described as the ultimate weapon of war. Next subtitle, The Ultimate Weapon of War. Mayer reported that the North Koreans' objective was to deny men the emotional support that comes from interpersonal relationships. To do this, the captors used 4 primary tactics. Number 1, informing. Number 2, self-criticism. Number 3, breaking loyalty to leadership and country. Number 4, withholding all positive emotional support. To encourage informing, the North Koreans gave prisoners rewards, such as cigarettes, when they snitched on one another. But neither the offender or the soldier reporting the violation was punished. The captors encouraged this practice for a different reason. Their intent was to break relationships and turn the men against each other. The captors understood that the soldiers could actually harm each other if they were encouraged to dip from their comrades' buckets every day. To promote self-criticism, the captors gathered groups of 10 or 12 soldiers and employed what Mayer described as a corruption of group psychotherapy. In these sessions, each man was required to stand up in front of the group and confess all the bad things he had done, as well as all the good things he could have done but failed to do. The most important part of this tactic was that the soldiers were not confessing to the North Koreans, but to their own peers. By subtly, by subtly eroding the caring, trust, respect, and social acceptance among the American soldiers, the North Koreans created an environment in which buckets of goodwill were constantly and ruthlessly drained. The third major tactic that the captors employed was breaking loyalty to leadership and country. The primary way they did this was by slowly and relentlessly undermining a soldier's allegiance to his superiors. The consequences were ghastly. In one case, a colonel instructed one of his men not to drink the water from a rice paddy field because he knew the organisms in the water might kill him. The soldier looked at his colonel and remarked, "Buddy, you ain't no colonel anymore. You're just a lousy prisoner like me. You take care of yourselves, and I'll take care of me." That soldier died of dysentery a few days later. In another case, 40 men stood by as 3 of their extremely ill fellow soldiers were thrown out of their mud hut by a comrade and left to die in the elements. Why did their fellow soldiers do nothing to help them? Because it wasn't their job. The relationship had been broken. The soldiers simply didn't care about one another anymore. But the tactic of withholding all positive emotional support while inundating soldiers with negative emotions was perhaps bucket dipping in its purest and most malicious form. If a soldier received a supportive letter from home, the captors withheld it. All negative letters, however, such as those telling of relative passing away or ones in which a wife wrote that she had given up on her husband's return and was going to remarry. The captors would even deliver overdue bills from collection agencies back home within less than 2 weeks of the original postmark. The effects were devastating. The soldiers had nothing to live for and lost basic belief in themselves and their loved ones, not to mention God and country. Mayer said that the North Koreans had put the American soldiers into a kind of emotional and psychological isolation, and the likes of which we had never seen. Next subtitle: Studying Positive Emotions. Moved by this story of psychological torture and deprivation, and perhaps inspired by the hope that these soldiers had not suffered or died in vain, Don Clifton and his colleagues decided to study the flip side of this horrific equation. They wondered if people can be literally destroyed by unrelenting negative reinforcement. Can they be uplifted and inspired to a greater degree by similar levels of positive reinforcement? In essence, they asked, can positive emotions have an even stronger impact than negative emotions? So the next page is chapter 2. I've just read the whole chapter. And the reason I'm bringing this out right now is, I think, for obvious reasons, but I feel like in so many ways we are suffering from the same kinds of um, the affect of the four strategies, the four tactics that were used. The informing is happening just in our social system. We have this process of wanting to be the first one to tell the story, wanting to, record something so that we can later use it against someone. Then there's the self-criticism. Well, we've all been set up for that just in our whole, I don't even want to get into that. That's a whole study of psychology there and marketing and what that does to the breakdown of our self-esteem. And then there's breaking loyalty to leadership and country. And God knows that's happening every time we turn anything on these days. We're looking at the debating, the back and forth, the gouging of character, and the real true characters of people showing up. And in that, there's some gaslighting going on because, people are kind of forced to pick a side of potentially two options that they don't appreciate either one of. So there's that. And then withholding all positive emotional support goes to, this whole pandemic and the isolation and the fact that we can't engage in the same way. We can't physically touch. We're not supposed to anyway. And of course, then all of the injustices around that, and all the division, and all the informing, the back and forth. They've actually put citizens in charge of informing. I don't know where it is in terms of where anybody listening lives, but here where I live in Canada, we're supposed to call the police when we hear. So it's things like that really set us up, and set us up to be railing against each other. And so this whole relentless negativity is taking its toll. And we can blame it on isolation. We can blame it on mask wearing and the lack of oxygen or whatever the theories are out there. But I'm looking to this phenomenon, this this idea that productivity can be killed by the disintegration of self-esteem and then the spiraling downward of um, our emotions, I think, and more importantly, that this is a strategy and that these are tactics used against humanity. So I'm not finger pointing. I'm not identifying, I'm just reading. I could have chosen not to say the sides and not to say who had the camps and just invite people to go read it themselves. But I hope you'll understand. Thank you.